On the morning of the 6th of May, 2023, somewhere inside the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, a woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades being the most reviled figure in British public life, sat in front of a mirror while a dresser adjusted the shoulders of a gown she would wear exactly once. The coronation was hours away. The rehearsals were finished. The crown, a modified version of Queen Mary's crown, its controversial Koh-i-Noor diamond quietly replaced with the Cullinan 3, 4, and 5 stones to avoid a diplomatic incident with India, wait on a velvet cushion in the Abbey. And at some point during those final private hours, according to a member of the household staff who later spoke to a biographer on condition of anonymity, Camilla referred to herself, for the first time anyone could recall, not as the Duchess, not as the Queen Consort, but simply as the Queen. The word landed in the room the way a coin lands on a table, small, definite, irreversible. The dresser paused. A protection officer standing near the door shifted his weight. Nobody corrected her. Nobody congratulated her. The moment passed. But the staff member who recounted it said that something in the texture of the household changed from that instant onward. Not because the title was new, it had been confirmed in palace communications weeks earlier, but because she had claimed it, aloud, in her own voice, with no audience that mattered. The woman who had once been introduced at a charity event as the lady who is here with the Prince of Wales, the woman whose role had been described by official spokespeople using a rotating menu of euphemisms for nearly 20 years, had stopped waiting for other people to define what she was. That shift from enduring a title to inhabiting it is the real story. Not the coronation itself, but what happened to Camilla Parker Bowles in the space between being told she could be queen and deciding that she was one. To understand what that moment cost and what it took to reach it, you have to go back. Not to the fairy tale, because there never was one. The story of Camilla Rosemary Shand begins in the unremarkable upper-middle-class comfort of 1940s and 1950s England, in a world where women of her background were educated just enough to be interesting at dinner and not so much that they might become inconvenient. She was born on the 17th of July, 1947, the eldest daughter of Major Bruce Shand, a decorated war hero and wine merchant, and Rosalind Cubitt, whose father was the 3rd Baron Ashcombe. This was not aristocracy in the grand sense. It was the comfortable gentry, good schools, good manners, enough money to avoid discussing it. Camilla attended Queensgate School in South Kensington and was later finished, that word tells you everything about the era, at the Montfertile Institute in Switzerland, and then at a school in Paris. She was presented as a debutante in 1965. The expectation was clear, though never spoken aloud in precisely these terms. She would be charming, she would be competent, she would marry well, and she would manage a household. There was no plan for a career. There was no plan for notoriety. She met Prince Charles in 1971, introduced, depending on which account you trust, either at a polo match in Windsor Great Park or at a mutual friend's house in Belgravia. The line she reportedly used, "My great-grandmother was your great-great-grandfather's mistress, so how about it?" has the ring of a story polished by decades of retelling, but it captures something true about her temperament. She was direct. She was funny. She did not perform deference. Charles, by every credible account, was captivated immediately, but the relationship stalled. Charles went to sea with the Royal Navy. Camilla, perhaps reading the institutional signals more clearly than he did, married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, a man who moved in the same social circles, a guards officer with his own complicated romantic history. The marriage produced 2 children, Tom and Laura. It was, by the standards of that world, perfectly adequate, and for a time that seemed to be the end of it. The public story, the one that would eventually detonate across tabloid front pages and parliamentary questions and the famous Panorama interview, did not begin in earnest until the mid-1980s, when Charles and Camilla's relationship resumed during his marriage to Diana Spencer. What happened next has been exhaustively documented, debated, dramatized in prestige television, and reduced to a set of cultural shorthand. 3 people in a marriage, the Camillagate tapes, the War of the Waleses, the divorce, and finally, on the 31st of August 1997, Diana's death in a Paris tunnel. For years after that, Camilla existed in a kind of public purgatory. She was Charles's companion, then his partner, then, in carefully staged increments managed by the palace communications apparatus, his acknowledged other half. The marriage came in 2005. She was given the title Duchess of Cornwall, not Princess of Wales, which was technically hers by right, because the palace calculated, correctly, that the public was not ready to hear Diana's title attached to the woman they blamed for Diana's unhappiness. And then began the long, patient, unglamorous work of rehabilitation, charity visits, quiet appearances, a deliberate absence of spectacle. Year after year, the polling numbers shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that a single act of heroism or a viral moment might shift them. They shifted the way coastlines shift, slowly, imperceptibly, and then one day you look and the geography is different. By the time Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022 and Charles III acceded to the throne, the question of what to call his wife had already been answered. Elizabeth herself, in her Platinum Jubilee message earlier that year, had expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. That phrase, sincere wish, carried the full weight of the institution behind it. It was not a suggestion, it was a directive dressed in politeness. There was a moment in the autumn of 2005, shortly after the marriage, when Camilla attended her first state banquet at Buckingham Palace as the Duchess of Cornwall. The setup was deliberately low-key, no grand entrance, no announcement of her arrival. She was walked in by a senior equerry through a side corridor rather than the main approach. But a footman stationed near the white drawing room noticed something. As she crossed the threshold, she reached out and touched the doorframe, briefly, with 2 fingers, the way a person touches a wall to steady themselves in the dark. The equerry did not break stride. A lady-in-waiting, following 2 paces behind, glanced down but said nothing. The footman later told a colleague in the household that it was the only time he had ever seen a member of the family, or anyone attached to the family, betray physical nervousness in that corridor. It revealed something the public narrative never captured, that the composure was not effortless. It was constructed, brick by brick, in rooms full of people who were watching for exactly the kind of crack she had just shown. In 2007, Camilla accompanied Charles on a tour of Uganda and was scheduled to visit a rape crisis centre in Kampala. The briefing documents, prepared by the prince's private office, had recommended a formal approach: arrive, be received by the director, tour the facility, speak to no one individually. Camilla read the brief and then set it aside. When she arrived, she asked to sit with the women rather than walk past them. A counsellor at the centre later told a BBC journalist that the Duchess had listened without speaking for nearly 8 minutes, an eternity in a royal schedule measured in 2-minute intervals. One woman had begun describing what had happened to her, and Camilla had simply held her hand. The protection officer, positioned by the door, later said it was the first time he had seen a principal deviate from a program without warning. The reaction among the travelling press was muted. The story did not fit the narrative of the scheming other woman. But for the staff who were there, it was the first indication that she understood something about the role that had nothing to do with protocol. During a reception at Clarence House in early 2009, Camilla was introduced to a young charity worker who, not recognizing the context, addressed her as Mrs. Parker Bowles. The room, small, perhaps 20 people, went briefly silent. A private secretary standing near the drinks table inhaled sharply enough to be noticed. Camilla looked at the young woman, paused for exactly one beat, and said, "Well, I have been called worse." The laughter that followed broke the tension instantly. The charity worker, mortified, began to apologize, but Camilla waved it off and asked her about her work. A journalist from the Evening Standard, who was present on a pool basis, later wrote that it was the most naturally disarming thing he had seen a royal do in 15 years of covering the family. What it revealed was a defense mechanism refined to the point of art. She had learned to metabolize humiliation and convert it into warmth. That skill does not develop in comfortable lives. In the summer of 2010, a senior member of the royal household, a figure who had served Elizabeth II for over 2 decades, was asked by a broadsheet journalist, off the record, how the Queen regarded the Duchess of Cornwall. The setup was a garden party at Buckingham Palace, one of the annual events where the press are allowed limited access. The official paused, chose his words with the care of a man handling a detonator, and said, "Her Majesty has observed that the Duchess does not complain." The journalist pressed for more. The official repeated the sentence verbatim and then walked away. A colleague of the official later confirmed that this was not a throwaway remark. It reflected a genuine assessment from the monarch herself. In a family where complaint was regarded as the most corrosive of weaknesses, where decades of public duty were expected to be borne without audible strain, the fact that Elizabeth chose to praise Camilla not for charm, not for diligence, but for silence, told you everything about the currency that mattered inside those walls. There was a fitting for the outfit Camilla would wear to the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton in April 2011. The designer, a trusted figure who had dressed her for several years, arrived at Clarence House with 3 options. The setup was routine. These fittings happened in a private sitting room, attended by one dresser and usually one lady-in-waiting. But during the fitting, Camilla asked the designer a question that surprised her. "Will it be too much?" The designer understood immediately. She was not asking about the fabric or the cut. She was asking whether she would draw the wrong kind of attention, whether her presence, her visibility, her appearance in photographs beside the bride would reignite the old narratives. The dresser, who had been adjusting a hem, looked up. The lady-in-waiting said nothing. The designer later told a fashion journalist that she had reassured the Duchess, but that the question itself had stayed with her. It revealed a woman who, even a decade into the marriage, was still calibrating her visibility against a hostility she expected to return at any moment. In 2013, Camilla visited a domestic violence shelter in London as part of her growing portfolio of work on abuse and sexual violence. A member of her private office had arranged for her to meet with 3 survivors in a private room. No cameras, no press pool, no written remarks. The setup was strictly confidential, and the staff had been briefed to keep the visit as quiet as possible. But one of the survivors, a woman in her 40s, recognized Camilla and said something unexpected. "You know what it's like to be hated, don't you?" The room went still. The private secretary, who had organized the visit, later said she stopped breathing. Camilla looked at the woman for a long moment and then said, "I know what it's like to read things about yourself that aren't true. But I never feared for my life. You did. That is not the same." A caseworker present in the room later described the exchange to a journalist, saying it was the most honest thing she had ever heard a public figure say in that setting. It revealed a woman who had absorbed the full weight of her public vilification, but refused to equate it with genuine suffering. During a private dinner at Highgrove in 2014, attended by a small group of friends and 2 members of Charles's household, the subject of the public's long memory came up in conversation. A guest, an old friend from Camilla's pre-royal life, mentioned that a recent poll had shown her approval ratings at their highest point ever. The setup was informal, wine had been poured, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Camilla's response, according to someone present, was immediate. "Polls are just weather. People made up their minds about me 30 years ago. The rest is just waiting." A member of Charles's staff who was serving that evening later told a colleague that the remark carried no bitterness. It was said as a statement of meteorological fact. The guest who had raised the topic fell quiet. Charles, seated at the head of the table, did not respond. What the remark revealed was a woman who, despite the measurable improvement in her public standing, did not believe in her own rehabilitation. She carried the old verdict with her like a stone in a coat pocket, acknowledged but never set down. A staff changeover at Clarence House in 2015 brought in a new junior private secretary, a young woman in her late 20s who had previously worked in government communications. During her first week, she was briefed by the outgoing secretary on the Duchess's preferences. No fuss, no elaborate seating plans, no speeches if they could be avoided. The setup was a standard handover meeting in a small office on the ground floor. But the outgoing secretary added one instruction that was not in any written brief. Never tell her she's doing well. She doesn't trust it. The new secretary, surprised, asked why. The outgoing official paused and said, "Because the last time everyone told her things were going well was 1994, and then the tapes were published." A household aide who was present during the handover later confirmed the exchange. The new secretary took the instructions seriously and never offered unsolicited praise during her tenure. What it revealed was that the institutional memory of Camilla's worst moment had become embedded in the operational culture of her household, not as gossip, but as a practical guideline for managing a principal who had been permanently marked by betrayal. Something shifted after the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in June 2022. The shift was not immediate and not dramatic. It was more like a thermostat being adjusted by a single degree. When Elizabeth II published her Accession Day message in February of that year, expressing her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king, the public reaction was muted. There were no riots. There were no petitions that gained serious traction. The tabloids ran the story for a day and moved on. But inside the household, the effect was seismic. A member of Camilla's staff later told a biographer that the Duchess read the message 3 times. The setup was a quiet morning at Raymill House, Camilla's private home in Wiltshire, where she was spending the weekend. She was alone, except for a housekeeper and her protection officer. She read the statement on her phone, then on a printed copy that had been sent by the palace communications team, then on her phone again. The housekeeper, who had been in the next room, later said she heard nothing. No exclamation, no phone call to Charles, no audible reaction of any kind. It was only later in the day, when Camilla spoke to a friend on the telephone, that she said anything about it. And what she said, according to someone who heard the friend's account, was, "She didn't have to do that." The reaction among senior royals was similarly restrained. This was the Queen's decision, and the Queen's decisions were not debated. But the revelation, for those who understood the dynamics, was that Elizabeth had done something no amount of public rehabilitation could accomplish. She had given Camilla permission to be queen in the one language that the institution understood, her own. After the Queen's death in September 2022, the machinery of succession moved with the speed and precision it had been rehearsing for decades. Charles became king. Camilla became queen consort. The title was confirmed, the letterhead was changed, the staff were rebriefed. But there was a gap between the title and the person. In those first weeks, according to multiple household sources, Camilla continued to refer to herself as the Duchess in informal settings. She would catch herself mid-sentence and correct to Queen Consort, but the instinct was older than the title. A lady-in-waiting who had served her for over a decade later described it as watching someone learn to answer to a new name. The setup was the daily life of the new court. Meetings, briefings, wardrobe consultations, the thousand small decisions that constitute royal existence. A dresser who helped prepare her outfits during this period noticed that Camilla would sometimes stand in front of the mirror longer than usual, not adjusting anything, just looking. When asked if everything was satisfactory, she would say, "Yes, fine," and move on. It was the protection officer, a man who had been with her for years and who understood her habits, who first remarked to a colleague that she seemed to be studying her own reflection as though verifying something. The reaction among the household staff was sympathy. They understood that the country was watching for a misstep. The revelation was that Camilla, at 75, was going through the most fundamental identity shift of her life, and she was doing it in full view of a nation that still had not entirely decided whether she deserved to be there. In late 2022, during preparations for the coronation, Camilla was presented with the initial designs for the ceremony's order of service. The setup was a planning meeting at Buckingham Palace, attended by senior household officials, representatives from the Archbishop of Canterbury's office, and 2 members of Camilla's own staff. The draft included the phrase, "Queen Consort," throughout. Camilla reviewed the document in silence, then asked a single question. "When does consort come off?" The room hesitated. A senior official from the Lord Chamberlain's office explained that the formal change from Queen Consort to Queen in official usage had been approved by the King, but had not yet been publicly announced. Camilla nodded and returned the document without further comment. A staff member present later said the question was not a demand. It was an inquiry about a bureaucratic timeline. But its effect was to surface a decision that the palace had been deferring. Within weeks, the official communications shifted. Buckingham Palace confirmed in February 2023 that she would be styled simply as Queen Camilla. A courtier who had been in the meeting later said the question was the most direct thing he had ever heard her say about her own title. During a private rehearsal for the coronation at Westminster Abbey in April 2023, Camilla walked through her part of the ceremony, the anointing, the crowning, the presentation, with the Archbishop and a small team of officials. The setup was deliberately private. The abbey was closed, the rehearsal was not photographed, and only essential personnel were present. At one point during the walkthrough, the Archbishop placed the practice crown on her head. It was not the real crown, that was kept under separate security, but a weighted replica used for rehearsal purposes. A member of the abbey's staff, who was positioned in the nave, later described what happened next. Camilla stood completely still for several seconds after the crown was placed. She did not adjust it, she did not smile. She looked straight ahead at the altar, and then, very quietly, she exhaled. The Archbishop, who had stepped back, waited. A lady-in-waiting standing in the south transept later said the moment lasted no more than 5 or 6 seconds, but it felt much longer. The reaction among the small group present was total silence. What the moment revealed, to those who witnessed it, was that until the weight was on her head, even the rehearsal weight, it had not been real. The abstract had become physical, and Camilla had needed a breath to absorb it. On the morning of the coronation itself, the 6th of May, 2023, a junior member of the household staff was tasked with bringing tea to the private apartments where Camilla was being prepared. The setup was the controlled chaos of coronation morning. Dressers, hairdressers, security personnel, and officials moving through rooms on a timetable measured in minutes. The staff member, who had been in the household for less than a year, knocked, entered, and set the tray down. As she turned to leave, Camilla, who was seated at the dressing table, said, without looking up, "The Queen takes her tea with milk, no sugar." It was said lightly, almost as an aside, and the dresser working on her hair smiled. The staff member paused, unsure whether it was a joke or an instruction. A protection officer by the door caught the staff member's eye and gave a small nod, take it at face value. The staff member left. Later that day, recounting the moment to a colleague, she said it was the first time she had heard the Duchess, the Queen, refer to herself in the third person, using the title. The revelation was not in the words themselves, but in the ease with which they were spoken. There was no gravity in the delivery, no ceremony. She had said it the way you say your own name, because it was hers. A footman who had served at Buckingham Palace for over 15 years and who was on duty during the coronation reception later that evening described a small moment that did not make any newspaper. The setup was the post-ceremony gathering, hundreds of guests, heads of state, dignitaries, the machinery of diplomatic hospitality running at full speed. At one point, Camilla was approached by a foreign ambassador's wife who curtsied and addressed her as Your Majesty. It was the correct form of address. It had been the correct form of address for months. But according to the footman, this was the first time he saw Camilla receive it without any visible adjustment. No blink, no micro-pause, no reflexive glance to check whether someone else in the room had been addressed. She simply said, "How lovely to see you," and moved the conversation forward. The footman later told a senior colleague that he had been watching for exactly this moment since the accession, because he had seen the same transition in other new members of the family, and it always came at a specific, identifiable point. The moment they stopped hearing the title as separate from themselves. In the weeks following the coronation, the household settled into its new patterns. A senior aide who had worked with Camilla for nearly a decade later described the change to a journalist in terms that were deliberately undramatic. The setup was a routine weekday at Buckingham Palace. Boxes, briefings, correspondence, the paper infrastructure of constitutional monarchy. The aide said that before the coronation, the Duchess had treated the schedule as something that happened to her. She showed up, she performed, she went home. After the coronation, there was a subtle but unmistakable shift in posture. She began asking questions about future engagements, not in terms of, what am I expected to do, but what should we be doing? The we was new. The aide said it appeared for the first time in a briefing about a hospital visit in June 2023. Nobody commented on it. The reaction was internal, a quiet recognition among the staff that the orientation had changed. She was no longer being carried by the institution. She had begun, in some small but definite way, to steer. A friend of Camilla's, someone who had known her since before Charles, since the days of the Shand family and the debutante circuit and the world that no longer existed, visited her at Buckingham Palace in the autumn of 2023. The setup was informal. Tea in a private sitting room, no staff present except a protection officer in the corridor. The friend later described the visit to a mutual acquaintance, who in turn shared the account with a biographer. The friend said she had expected to find the same Camilla, the dry humour, the self-deprecation, the instinct to deflect attention. And all of that was still there, but there was something else. At one point, discussing a public engagement that had gone particularly well, Camilla said something that her friend found startling. "I think I might actually be quite good at this." The friend laughed, assuming it was a joke. Camilla did not laugh. She said it again, more quietly. "No, I mean it. I think I might be good at this." The friend later said it was the first time in over 40 years of friendship that she had heard Camilla make an unqualified, positive statement about herself. The revelation was not that she had become arrogant. Nothing in the account suggested that. It was that she had finally reached a point where her own competence was no longer something she needed to deny in order to survive. What the evidence tells us, taken as a whole, is something more interesting than a rehabilitation story. Rehabilitation implies that a damaged thing is restored to its original state. What happened to Camilla Parker Bowles was not restoration. It was construction. She built a version of herself that could survive inside an institution that had, at various points, tried to erase her, minimize her, euphemize her, and define her solely in relation to a dead woman's grief. The version she built was not the version the public wanted. It was not glamorous. It was not theatrical. It lacked the raw emotional transparency that made Diana a global icon, and that, paradoxically, made Diana's life inside the institution almost unbearable. What Camilla built instead was something durable, functional, and almost invisible. She became the person in the room who did not need to be the most important person in the room. And then, very late in the game, she became the most important person in the room anyway, because the room was the Abbey and the crown was on her head. The polling data reflects this trajectory in its own bloodless way. In 2005, after the marriage, her approval rating hovered around 20%. By 2022, it had risen to the low 50s, not beloved, but accepted. Not Diana, but not the villain anymore either. The numbers tell you what happened. They do not tell you what it cost. The anecdotal record, the touched door frame, the 8 minutes of silence in Kampala, the refusal to equate her suffering with that of genuine victims, the instruction to staff never to praise her, the question about when consort would be removed, paints a portrait of a woman who understood with absolute clarity that she was operating on a deficit that could never be fully repaid. The public had decided she was guilty in 1992, and nothing she did afterward could overturn the verdict.
She could only outlast it. And she did. Not through strategy, though the palace communications machine was undeniably effective. Not through charm, though she possesses it in quantities that surprise people who expect to dislike her. She outlasted it through the simple, brutal, unglamorous act of showing up. Day after day, year after year, engagement after engagement, she showed up. She showed up when the crowds were thin and the cameras were hostile and the editorials called for her to be removed. She showed up when it would have been easier, and arguably more dignified, to retreat to Wiltshire and let the dogs and the garden absorb the rest of her life. That she chose not to retreat tells you something about her character. Whether it tells you something admirable or something stubborn depends on your view of the institution she married into. But it is a fact, and facts are what we have. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage. It does not involve physical danger or moral stands or dramatic gestures. It involves waking up and walking into a room where you know with certainty that a significant number of the people in that room have already decided who you are and what you deserve. It involves doing this not once in a burst of defiance, but repeatedly for decades, until the repetition itself becomes the argument. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. What Camilla understood, perhaps before anyone around her did, was that the British monarchy does not operate on the timescale of news cycles or public opinion polls. It operates on the timescale of generations, and on that timescale, persistence is the only strategy that works. The Windsors survive not because they are loved, they are, intermittently, but that is not the mechanism, but because they are still there. Camilla adopted that logic and applied it to herself. She would be still there. She would be still there after the outrage, still there after the documentaries and the dramatizations and the anniversary pieces, still there after the people who hated her most had moved on to hating someone else. The institution's greatest weapon has always been its patience, and she borrowed it. So return to that morning, the 6th of May, 2023, the private apartments, the dresser adjusting the gown, the protection officer by the door, and the woman in the chair who said, for the first time in anyone's hearing, the word that would define the rest of her life. When she said, the Queen, she was not claiming something that did not belong to her. The title was hers, confirmed by the late Queen, ratified by the institution, endorsed by the Church, accepted by the public in sufficient numbers to make objection futile. What she was doing was something more private and more significant. She was closing a gap. For 30 years, there had been a space between who Camilla Parker Bowles was and what the world said she was. Every euphemism, every careful phrasing, every diplomatic avoidance of the word wife or partner or princess had widened that gap. The gap was the story. It was the source of her suffering and, ultimately, the engine of her transformation. And on that morning, with a single word spoken to no one who would report it at the time, she closed it. The woman and the title met. The dresser resumed her work. The protection officer remained at his post. Outside, London was beginning to fill with crowds who had come to watch a coronation, most of them carrying opinions about the woman at its centre that had been forming for longer than some of them had been alive. She would walk out to meet those opinions in a few hours. She would wear the crown. She would sit beside the king. And for the first time, she would do all of it as the person she had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that she was. The gap was closed. The Queen had arrived. She had been arriving for a very long time.